When you look at Malcolm, you look at his struggle on all levels, from being a hustler to an intellectual, and showing you that you can do it.
How about you? What do you know about Malcolm X?
He a black man and a good.
At the end of his life, he was thinking, we have to work together.
Because he stood up for what he believed in, and he said, by any means necessary. That's what I believe in.
The release of the film has broadened the general public's knowledge of who Malcolm X was. But encouraging people to continue to inform themselves is a concern of Attallah Shabazz, the eldest of Malcolm and Betty Shabazz's 6 daughters. She touched on personal aspects of her father's life in a recent lecture in Minneapolis.
People think I grew up in an angry house. My household was a very romantic, frolicky household. One that in reflection is wonderful for me as an adult, but as a kid I thought my parents were much too mushy. And that when I grow up I'm going to have to take care of them. But what I realize is that, as I recall, they were young parents. Vulnerability was displayed. The ache, the joy, the laughter, the cry, the balance of development I was privy to. So that when the world thought that it was just this hard-edged household, I could not understand from what they got that image. So I know it's a cut and paste. I am a person who has watched someone change the image of another, the perceptions of another, and control your mindsets as a result of teaching you so. My mother ran our household. My father was amongst us, one of the buddy-o-pal kind of parents, you know, a partner in crime. And when my mother would come in with a request, such as, Malcolm, get the children ready so we can get ready for dinner. And she'd go on and explain the left and the right of it, and he'd insert, all right, brown sugar. And in the middle of her dissertation, she'd and she'd try to find her place again and continue on, giving her instructions of what he should do to make life easier in preparation for the next 20 minutes, and he'd insert again, of course, my brown sugar. And she'd weaken. And as we'd trot to the kitchen and get everything done, he'd hum and carry on while she was eating. My mother talked about the fact that she couldn't boil water before she married my father. But my mother was known for having a household that smelt like fine cuisine. And she'll tell you that love taught her how to cook. And I say this to you because simultaneous to me as a youngster, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, feeling wonderful and comfortable about the Nubianness of my household, the brownness of my household, watching my father nurture my mother. In terms of her hues, I thought my mother was a queen. I had no idea that outside of my house, that people who indeed were brown didn't feel as wonderful. I didn't know that outside of that house, that it was a crime or a burden or a stigma to be brown. And as we listen to Malcolm Shabazz, as you read texts or film footage, ask yourself, is it Malcolm per Malcolm that you are listening to, or Malcolm per the organization for which he represented? Now, after 1963, the fall of 1963, November, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, my father was asked what he thought about the death. He answered, not as a spokesperson, but as a civilian, which got him in trouble. He responded that he thought it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. It wasn't just his commentary that disturbed the organization for which he represented, but it was that he had one at all. So that we have to watch that when we represent something, that you don't lose yourself amidst the representation for somebody else. Am I clear? As he was silenced to 90 days without any public commentaries or the right to, as a civilian or otherwise, he chose on the other end of those 90 days to not regain or rejoin his membership or participation in the organization, the Nation of Islam, and started his quest and learnings abroad, which introduced him to a world that was not in his existence here in the United States, and frayed all of the teachings that he had expounded and taught others some 7 years.
When I was on the pilgrimage, I had close contact with Muslims whose skin would in America be classified as white, and with Muslims who themselves would be classified as white in America. But these particular Muslims didn't call themselves white. They looked upon themselves as human beings, as part of the human family, and therefore they looked upon all other segments of the human family as part of that same family. Now, they had a different look or a different air or a different attitude than that which is reflected in the attitude of the man in America who calls himself white. So I said that if Islam had done that for them, perhaps if the white man in America would study Islam, perhaps they could do the same thing for him. And that our problem is not an American problem, it's a human problem. It's not a Negro problem, it's a problem of humanity. It's not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights.
He says there are probably less than 7,000 members now in the Muslim.
Well, it has fallen apart. No, thank you. It has fallen apart. And dissatisfied black Americans are now free to participate into the full swing of the struggle that's going on in this country, and I think it will be inclined to step up the tempo.
Let's take some time to fill in important gaps about Malcolm's life that are missing despite the scope and scale of the movie. We've expanded our group here in the studio to include some more friends, and joining us by satellite is Zak Condo, the author of a soon-to-be published book that unravels the assassination of Malcolm X. If you're watching Tuesday night, we are taking phone calls, and the number to call is 229-1400. That number is 229-1400, so please give us a call so you can join in on the conversation. Alice, you were talking before about Malcolm's pan-Africanism, and that piece that you felt was not really addressed well in the movie. What exactly, you were in Africa, living in Ghana, when Malcolm traveled there in '64. Why did he travel through Africa? What was his mission?
He had two purposes on that trip. He was familiarizing himself with parts of Africa he had not visited before, but his main mission was an effort to get an African country to bring charges against the United States before the United Nations for human rights violations. He had elevated the African American struggle from that of civil rights, which would be a domestic issue encased only within the United States, to a human rights issue, which would be international. He was building on the work that Bill Patterson had done back in the 40s when the United Nations was first founded, when he attempted to petition against the United States for the crime of genocide against the African people here. That was Malcolm's purpose, going from capital to capital, trying to get an African head of state to charge the United States with human rights violations. He also, in 1964, had addressed the second summit meeting of the Organization of African Unity and had gotten them to pass a resolution condemning the United States for its mistreatment of the African American population. So he was really our diplomat in Africa. He was our representative. And that's the way he was received by Africans, ordinary people, and governments.
And how did you meet him when he came? What was the circumstance?
I was living in Ghana at the time and had been there since October of '62. And we had a group of African Americans who were not connected with the U.S. Embassy, but who considered ourselves political refugees from the United States. And we were eager to start a branch of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was Malcolm's new organization. And we received him when he came and helped to develop the program for he spent a week in Ghana from May the 10th to May the 17th, 1964. He had 6 days of really active time. And we took him around, we developed the program for him, and made sure that people got a chance to meet him. Malcolm was very, very well known. People were eager to meet him. The pressmen were eager to host him. He met with President Kwame Nkrumah. That was the most important meeting that he had in Africa. He addressed large audiences. People just fell in love with him.
I think it's important. I mean, information that Alice is sharing with us here needs to be clarified in relationship to the story in the film. The film makes it appear as though Malcolm's pilgrimage is his first trip to the continent, when in fact he has made several trips before then. I've talked to West Africans who heard Malcolm speak in Nigeria and elsewhere on some of the earlier trips. So it's not as a first comer to the African continent that Malcolm went on Hajj. But it has to be seen in different contexts.
Right. Zach, I know you've done a lot of work and research around Malcolm's last year. How do you see this period in his life? What impact did it have on the world around him and the forces that eventually led to his death?
Yeah, well, first I think it had a very significant impact, to say the least. One of the major weaknesses of the movie is that you get no sense whatsoever of the linkages that Malcolm was trying to establish in Africa as well as in Asia. And of course, these linkages were very significant as far as the struggle of African peoples in the United States. The sister has already alluded to his UN campaign, and I think that for the most part, there is so much that we need to understand about his UN campaign. And of course, the movie did virtually nothing other than having just one scene in which they had him saying, yeah, I intend to take the United States to the United Nations. You know.
Alice, I would make one point, too, that I think is important to understand in a broader context of the film of Malcolm X, and that is the relevance today and the social significance of the film. It was interesting, in anticipation of this program, I called up the Minneapolis Library to see what books are in, and virtually all of them have been checked out. Clearly, this is an epic event, and that has struck a responsive chord. And I think in many respects, if you step back, Malcolm is causing us to revisit a central question in this country, and that is the legitimacy and the viability and the desirability of integration or assimilation. Is it possible and or desirable? This is a long-standing debate in the African-American community. Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X have brought that issue to the fore. I think the film, again, forces us to look at that issue. In addition, I think Malcolm X, particularly for many young African Americans, embodies commitment, integrity, and a sense of meaning and commitment. This is something I think many African American youth are desperately searching for, and they see that embodied in Malcolm X. Now, whether he warrants that or not is a very, I think, a question the scholars debate, but I think that he has struck a very responsive chord. If you were to go out into the African American community today, I think many young black people would see the Islamic community as a group of people who are very committed and honest and have a degree of integrity and self-sacrifice. I think he represents that, and that strikes a very, very responsive chord. And I think that's the cause of the phenomena, those two factors.
You know, the interesting thing about that, though, is that as a Muslim, one of the things that we were always concerned about is the fact that people were only seeming to segmentize or compartmentalize Malcolm and say, I only want this piece of Malcolm. And we saw the Islamic piece and that development from the criminal to the person of high moral stature as being a critical change or shift in his life. And a lot of people say, well, he became into a new political reality, but first he came into a new ethical and moral reality that changed his whole way of looking at things and therefore changed his whole behavior and his whole outlook on life. The other thing that's important is that for the first time with this movie, it's been able to answer something like a TV program as opposed to reading a book, which in this case it seems to have served. People have always asked us questions. Why did you change? Why did you, what we consider evolving, people have always like, well, why you guys aren't doing with the bow ties and the bald heads anymore? Why aren't you out on the corners with the bean pies anymore? And Malcolm was moving away from that. And that movement started back in the 1960s, but a lot of people didn't understand it. And then, you know, now with the popularity of the resurgence of the bean pies and bald heads and the bow ties, people are saying, well, how come you're not like that? I think that that helped to answer many of the questions that we had and also sparked a renewed interest in the total development of Malcolm X as a Muslim.
Well, I'm delighted that the movie was made, no matter what its shortcomings may be. And I didn't expect him, Spike Lee, to be able to capture all of that. I, too, was a little nervous about Spike making the movie in light of the other kinds of material that he handled, which was rather parochial. And this was rather epic in proportions, dealing with 5 decades. And I think he did a fairly good job, all things considered, of putting the right metaphors in there. Of course he wasn't able to. I could talk all day about what I think is missing, and it's the international dimension. Pan-Africanism was really important. I would like to have seen a little more said internally about the family, as others have noted. I think that the transformation of him, to me, and this is the part that is very instructive to young people, every life has an essence and many aspects to it. And the essence of the Malcolm X that we know was a 13-year public career as a Muslim, no matter what else he was. He was not anything for very long. If you remember, the criminal life didn't, what, 5 years, prison 6 years? He was a child most of the early part of his life, but the essence of his life, not the aspects, is what we need to push and try to help young people understand, that everybody has an essence in their life. This is who he is. Nobody is perfect. The who-ness of Malcolm is that ethical transformation. Yes, that comes first. Then the political transformation and the kind of responsibility that he had to people. And the other thing I think is important in the movie is that Malcolm had he represented a kind of a fundamental common denominator, which drew a broad cross-section of people to him. When I saw Malcolm X 3 times in 1962, 3 straight nights, what was interesting at this revival of sorts, in which they allowed non-Muslims to come in and the auditorium was packed, every voice imaginable in the African-American community was represented there. From, you know, the working class people, the unemployed, the uneducated, to the keenest intellectuals. They were all there. I was fresh out of college myself, were all represented. He represented that common denominator that true patriots represent. That's what he is to me, a patriot, somebody who loves his people, his country, and is willing to give his life for their freedom and their dignity. That is the essence of Malcolm X's life. And patriots come from everywhere. They don't come from any particular place. They come from universities. They can be well-read or uneducated. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. He is the quintessential patriot for us in our time and context.
I think we have...